So with this, I would like to start the lecture, and I would just start with a small description of the frame of this lecture. Since 2018, the University of Bonn pools expertise in sustainability research across faculties in the transdisciplinary research areas. And one of these transdisciplinary research areas is the TRA6 Innovation Technology for Sustainable Futures. The TRA6 organizes the lecture series Innovation Pathways to Sustainability as a forum for high-profile and internationally visible scientists who are active in academia, but also in the science policy interface. We ask the speakers to address research opportunities to enhance sustainability in all its dimensions, including social, environmental, and economic. And the speakers are invited to present cutting-edge research in their fields and discuss related future research agendas with the audience. The theme today is energy. All of us rely on energy, and all of us know that it's a big question on how to provide this energy, how to provide it at all, but even more so how to provide it sustainably. And then connected to this also the question on how much energy we will and might and should use. And the critical sub-question, of course, is for what we should use energies, and as I said, how much. Now, for these lectures, for the discussion of this subject, we have invited Julia Steinberger. Julia Steinberger is a professor at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland, where she researches and teaches in the interdisciplinary areas of ecological economics and industrial ecology. Her research examines the connection between resource use, energies, but also materials, resources, greenhouse gas emissions, and social performance, economic activity, and human well-being. She's also a lead author for the IPCC 6th assessment report, and in the working group 3, I think. And this has been a very, very, very important recent publication. Most importantly, I think she is the recipient of the Leverholm Research Leadership Award for her research on living well within limits, investigating how universal human well-being might be achieved within planetary boundaries, especially with respect to energy consumptions. This is the subject of today's talk of Julia. And I'm very sorry to say that I can't give you the floor, but I can give you the screen now. So please take it. We're looking very much forward to the lecture, and thank you already now very much for joining us.
So thanks for your kind introduction, and I am hoping to keep to some kind of time. So that's going to be the main goal here. So it's very nice to be with you, even though not in person. I hope you can see my screen without too many issues. And I will tell you about living well within planetary limits. So what kind of research we're doing, is it possible, what is it going to take? And so thank you very much for this invitation, and I really look forward to our discussion. So I'm just today we're in the context of a whole bunch of climate demonstrations happening. So I'm going to talk about that a bit as well at the end. This is a picture from what's happening in London today. And I think it's quite relevant in terms of the kinds of research we all need to do. So I'm going to say a few words about the climate context, give you some information about the Living Well Within Limits project, and what that might mean for all of us moving forward. So the climate context is well known, but climate impacts are all around us. This is a picture taken from the last fall. But obviously the summer was particularly damaging. So in short, we are doing this. We are taking the planet out of the Holocene temperature range. It is now well out of it in terms of the range of the past sort of 12,000 years, during which time the human species developed agriculture, writing, cities, and anything we might call civilization. We are now sort of 1.2 degrees beyond the baseline, which was sort of pre-industrial temperature ranges. And our mission, in order to stop doing that and go even further out into this era of increasing harm and impacts, our emissions need to sort of drop to zero very, very fast. And the problem with that is that we have economic, political, social, and technological systems that are very much still attached to fossil fuel use. And there's also sort of a reason that we are in our current pathway. And I just like people to remember that who could have possibly known what future they were pushing us into, or what future was attached to our current trajectory. And this is a graph showing carbon dioxide concentrations. That's the left-hand side of the plot, I think for you as well. And temperature increase, that's the right-hand side of the plot. And the carbon dioxide level is actually really, really close to what was measured, for instance, in 2020. It's actually pretty spot on. The temperature, unfortunately, they underestimated. We're well above the temperature that they projected. But this is still a remarkable achievement in terms of scientific projection, considering the fact that this plot was made in the early 1980s, so about 40 years ago. And of course, it was from an Exxon internal report. So I think one of the things we really have to realize is that we are in a future that was created to us by a specific industry, by specific economic sectors. And that's something that we really have to take very seriously, is to responsibility and also understanding how much and how fast we can change things, also using that knowledge. So the implications for research are that urgent and large-scale action is required, so radical emissions reductions. And in my view, or maybe in a general view, the surest and fastest way to do this is to just reduce consumption, reduce demand for energy. But especially because reducing demand doesn't require as much new technology or infrastructure. But to date, there's very little or no research on how consumption could be reduced while preserving or enhancing well-being. So there's been this sort of assumption that more is better. And as a result, research and policy development have not been done in this direction at all at the same level as the supply side has been considered. And it's also what Kevin has led Kevin Anderson to say, we haven't even tried mitigation yet. We haven't even tried just reducing consumption. So this has led us to develop a new framework, the Living Well Within Limits project, or the Lili project. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. Quite a lot about that. So this is the analytic framework of the Living Well Within Limits project. So it's basically what we developed in order to be able to do this research, sort of a different worldview, where you start with your biophysical inputs. We're going to be talking about energy a lot. So we have planetary processes linked to our use that are being disrupted by our use of natural resources, in particular energy, but not only. And these are mediated through provisioning systems which have both physical and social characteristics that are really important to understand, that give us social outcomes. And the social outcomes we're interested in are need satisfaction and well-being. And we believe that need satisfaction is a prerequisite for well-being. So all of this, the integrated nature of provisioning systems, that they have both social and physical aspects, and what that means for our social outcomes is all very important to us, and a new way of doing research. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about well-being, because it might be sort of a fuzzy concept. For me, it certainly was. And I'll just tell you about it a bit in cartoon form. So welcome to ancient Greece, because that's sort of where people first started talking about this topic in a way that we can recognize and grapple with. And there's sort of two camps in Greece. So in 3050 BC, Aristotle came along and said, you know what, well-being means being able to live life as fully as possible and flourish within society. And just a few years later, sort of 50 years later, Epicure came on the scene and had this different perspective that well-being means achieving the most positive and least negative feelings possible. And you might recognize Epicure's definition more than you recognize Aristotle's. And in fact, as all good academic disputes go, the two camps that have these two different definitions of well-being persist to this day, and you have to choose a team, even if you're doing research today. So if you are on Team Epicure, you might have a perspective of well-being as happiness. It's an individual perspective. You might recognize it as measured by the happiness indicator or the utility function in economics. That's a very sort of mainstream way of measuring more good and less bad. And you might also have a very, very friendly attitude towards economic growth, because you might interpret more income as more consumption, as more positive feelings, because in a mainstream economic view of the world, the more income you have, the more you can spend it in the market to gain utility. Your utility is sort of based on consumption. However, if you're on Team Aristotle, you're going to have a very different view of the world. You're going to have a perspective that's interested in flourishing. It's going to be social rather than individual. You might try to measure it through the Human Development Index or through Sustainable Development Goals. It's a very multidimensional rather than single-dimensional perspective. And your view on the economy is that it is a perspective of, it's a view of, that's an idea of development rather than growth. So that our goal is to develop the economy, to qualitatively improve it so that it can support human potential. It's not necessarily a more is better or growth oriented perspective. And we looked at these, we did a whole bunch of reading at the beginning of all of this when we were getting started, and we decided that we were recruits of Team Aristotle, and we wrote a bunch of papers on this, so at least two of which sort of go in the direction of explaining why we think that this Aristotelian direction is the right one to go for sustainability research and for climate and energy research as well. So I encourage you to look at that if you have more questions on it. But there's also, there's sort of some more theoretical aspect to it, but there's also sort of an empirical aspect to it. So if we believe that Aristotle's worldview is correct, we should be able to test it. So we should be able to make this link between need satisfiers and human well-being. And to do that, we sort of take an updated version of Aristotle's theory, which is the theory of human need of Doyle and Guff, which was published in 1991. And they basically are the ones that came up with this list of need satisfiers that they describe as universal, satiable, non-substitutable, and I'm going to forget the last one, finite, but multidimensional, but finite as well. So you have this list of need satisfiers. When they're satisfied, since they're satiable, does that lead to well-being or not? And we can test this. So we looked for empirical evidence for this, and this is published in the supplementary materials of our Nature Sustainability article in 2018. So look for it there. So basically what we're doing is we're putting countries in a bin, numbered from 0 to 9 on this graph, depending on the number of need satisfiers they achieve according to our database and according to the limits, the sort of satiable limits we set. We don't care which need satisfiers they are. We just say if you achieved 1, you're in this bin. If you've achieved 2, you're in this other bin. And then we average the life satisfaction of these countries. And life satisfaction is a subjective indicator that people generally associate with well-being. So that's one way to measure this. And we find this result, which is extremely strong and extremely convincing to say that indeed, the way you achieve well-being is you keep satisfying people's needs. The more needs you satisfy, the more people's well-being, subjective or objective, will be clear. And you can also do the same thing for physical health. So here measured as average life expectancy in years, where the relationship is, if anything, even stronger because there's sort of a saturation effect, where once a certain number of needs are satisfied, you pretty much max out on your average healthy life expectancy. So we believe that this provides us with a good basis for focusing on need satisfiers. And we then went on to sort of study, does well-being within limits exist internationally? So basically looking at this social foundation of Kate Raworth's Doughnut and looking at the outside, at the environmental ceiling, at the planetary boundaries. So we sort of did an international study of this. I'm not going to go into it, where we found that no country currently satisfies the social foundation while remaining within planetary boundaries. Usually you have one or the other. Including Germany. Germany is particularly sort of good on social foundations, terrible on planetary boundaries. So then the question after that becomes, how do we get into the donut? So we know we're not in the safe and just space for humanity right now. We are not living well within limits. So the question becomes, how do we get there? And how we get inside the donut has a lot of different elements to it, which I'm going to be talking about. But one of the things we certainly thought was that macro social factors, including distribution, are going to be very important. And so here, for instance, you have a picture of very extreme inequality between shanty towns and nice sort of leafy apartment buildings. And so the question we decided to do is we decided to interrogate intranational inequality in energy use. So here, what we're doing in this study, the reason it was new is we're looking not only at international inequality, we're looking at intranational inequality. So, and we're looking at it across product groups, so across income groups and across product groups for a whole bunch of countries. And that was the title of our paper, which we think was very descriptive. And when it was reported in the BBC, they decided to say, climate change, the rich are to blame, which is true. But also maybe we had more results than just chat, let's put it that way. So what we do in the study, we're measuring direct and indirect energy footprints using environmentally extended multi-regional input-output as an assessment tool for different categories of products, 86 countries divided into income classes. And this gives us a whole lot of multidimensional resolution. To get into the results, we find, so these are Lorentz curves that show distribution of energy use on the vertical axis across population. On the horizontal axis, these curves are how you measure the Gini coefficient, for instance. And the further away you are from the line of equality, the more unequal your energy use is. And sort of the total energy footprint is the red curve, and you can see it's already reasonably unequal. But some categories of energy use are a lot more unequal than the average energy use. And those have to do with transport. We're talking about package holiday, which has a lot of flying in it, vehicle fuel, so driving, and other transportation categories have a lot of inequality. And what that means is that we were able to map product categories, and I think this is a really important result, into product categories that are consumed more by rich people, so have an elasticity higher than 1, or consumed more by poor people, elasticity lower than 1, and more energy intensive versus less energy intensive. So basically, one of the things we find is this really interesting sort of luxury and high intensity quadrant up here that are the energy intensive goods and services used more, consumed disproportionately by rich people. And one of the things that's super interesting that we were not expecting is that it's pretty much entirely transport categories. So basically, rich people drive and fly, whereas poorer people, their energy intensive activity is mainly heat and electricity in buildings. So it's sort of the dwelling aspect. So you really have this dichotomy between buildings versus transportation that comes out of this plot, out of this mapping. And I think this also has policy implications, right? Because this high energy intensity consumption of richer populations is something you cannot grow your way out of. So here you're really in a problem where you have to tax and regulate in order to get away from it, because the richer the population, the more they can just use their extra income to keep pursuing this kind of activity. Whereas here you have a problem where you can't expect people themselves, since it's more poor people, they are not going to be able to pay their way out of it either. So that here you really need public investment in efficiency and low carbon energy generation. And if you were clever, you might think that the taxation regulation in transport would help you with your public investment in efficiency and low carbon in buildings. So that's one of the findings we had. I just really want, especially because I'm talking to a German audience, I really need to hammer home this point about transport being a disaster. So this is a study, not by my team, but by 2 people at the International Energy Agency, that's showing that in terms of carbon emissions, SUVs by themselves, so just heavier cars, sports utility vehicles, are one of the driving factors in the global CO2 increase in the last decade, whereas all other cars actually showed a decrease in emissions. And so I think this is really something that we have to take very seriously. And Tim Gore of Oxfam basically said, listen, this is something that governments have to take very seriously in terms of curbing these emissions through taxes and bans, and revenues should be invested in public services and low carbon sectors. And again, to reiterate this point of inequality being a huge problem in climate change and sustainability. The United Nations emissions gap report came out with this really stunning visualization of inequality, where you showing that the top 10% of population emits roughly half of all emissions globally, whereas the bottom 50% of the population globally emits less than 10%. So we have a hugely unequal system, and that's something that we really have to face. Okay, so what happens if we have this huge inequality problem? What happens if we make distributions more equal? So the inequality in resource use comes from inequality in income. So what Yannick Oswald did as sort of his next project is he made an income redistribution model. So that basically takes income distribution, turns it into expenditure distribution. From that, you get income elasticities of demand. Well, you use the income elasticities of demand and the energy intensities of our previous study, including some Monte Carlo simulation in case something was funny with those. And you get new final energy footprint accounts. And I think it's a very sort of elegant and simple thing to do, but the results are quite interesting. So this is the income distribution that we start with is the red one. So it's global income across cumulative population. And you can see that what we're doing is we're basically stretching it out or squeezing it. So the blue line is a very, very equal model, whereas, you know, the green line will be a very, very unequal model. And when you change the distribution, you change the Gini coefficient, so the level of inequality, and that changes your net energy use globally. And what's interesting is that a super equal distribution only, so basically you've redistributed income globally completely and changed nothing else. That results in a 7% increase in global energy use, which is really not very much. Whereas you make it even more unequal than it is now, you reduce energy use by about 3%. So you're really talking about, you know, you can wildly change income distribution without necessarily changing energy use very much at all. So that's sort of the first result. But what's really interesting is that what you're doing is you're changing the sector in which energy consumption happens. That shifts enormously because you can see that your sort of stereotype of a low energy consumer is going to be consuming a lot more energy in buildings, which is the orange part, and much less in transportation, whereas a mega consumer, that is totally shifted. They're going to be spending a lot less energy in buildings and a lot more in transport. And that shift actually means something for climate. So a more equitable distribution leads to more global energy use in the dwelling sector, and that turns as whereas more unequal leads to more in transport, and that actually has implications for decarbonization because so that's why Yannick then wrote this piece in the conversation, putting the two results together and saying, actually, it's easier to decarbonize buildings. So a more equal world in theory would be easier to decarbonize than a more unequal one, because the dwelling sector is easier to decarbonize than transportation. And I think that that's an interesting thing to think about. So we did sort of a next study in terms of trying to understand how to get within Cape Raworth's donut. And here what we're doing is we're looking at international mediating factors between energy consumption, energy demand, and need satisfiers. So this is a study that was published in Global Environmental Change earlier this year. It's a quantitative model where we're basically saying, listen, need satisfaction is correlated with energy use, but there's also this provisioning system aspect in the middle, which not only has distribution and inequality in it, but a whole bunch of other stuff as well. So we're going to look at provisioning system factors, and we're also going to look at an interaction term that tells us sort of the domain of validity and the interaction between these different, the energy use and the provisioning system factors. And that's sort of the model that we're working with. And it might look a bit complicated, but the results are very, very clear and very simple. So as a schematic, what we're doing, as I showed in the previous slides, we're balancing energy use with human need satisfaction and looking at the influence of these provisioning factors in the middle. And graphically, or sort of qualitatively, what it looks like is you have this relationship between need satisfaction and energy use. It's usually a saturation kind of relationship. And if you're looking at a provisioning factor that's beneficial, it's going to tend to move that curve up. A high value of a beneficial provisioning factor is going to move this whole curve up. You get higher need satisfaction at lower energy use. Whereas if you have a high value of a detrimental provisioning value factor, it's going to push the whole curve down. It's basically going to make it harder to achieve need satisfaction at any level of energy use that you have. And what we do is we test this for these different provisioning factors here, like public service quality, public health, electricity access, et cetera. And we test and see, are you a good provisioning factor? Are you beneficial or are you detrimental? And that's what we show in the next plot. So the green factors are, let me just see if I can get rid of this thing, but I don't think I can. So if your provisioning factor is beneficial, it's green. And that means that it's beneficial across a whole range of different relationships between energy and need satisfaction. If it's detrimental, it's red. And you can see that some provisioning factors are very, very strongly beneficial, including income equality, including democratic quality, including electricity access, which is fantastic, including public service and public health expenditure. However, some other factors are really, really terrible. So extractivism in an economy based on extractive activities, that it will be a negative, detrimental provisioning factor, or even economic growth past a certain level. So past a moderate income, economic growth is detrimental in this relationship. And both trade penetration, foreign direct investment weren't significant. So we can really see that different macroeconomic conditions have very different outcomes in this relationship. Another study we did is we decided to model a low energy and high well-being future to see what that would look like. This is based on the Decent Living Energy Framework of Narasimha Rao at Yale University, and it connects human needs to sufficient levels of energy services. It's a global model, and it takes into account technology improvements, equal distribution, and results in lower demand levels. So the model looks something like this. You have your decent living standards involved, which include things like the human needs we've been talking about: nutrition, shelter, clothing, mobility, communication, information, healthcare, and education. There's some things it doesn't take into account, obviously, as well. And these are translated into different levels of consumption, different levels of energy services effectively, which have both direct energy implications, embodied energy implications. There's an aspect of private sector consumption. There's an aspect of public sector consumption. So we decided to model hospitals and schools. And there's also infrastructure for all of this. So we're basically, again, using the sort of input-output apparatus to sort of estimate what those embodied energy and direct energy components do for us, but with very, very strong emphasis on the most efficient technologies we can model. And the results look something like this. So this was published last year in Global Environmental Change. So our model is the DLE, the Decent Living Energy Model. And it's basically how low can you go while prioritizing human needs satisfaction and decent living conditions for everybody. It's really quite low compared to, for instance, the International Energy Agency reference scenario, or even their 2 degree or beyond 2 degree scenario. So we come to about 40% of current final energy use, despite population growth in 2050, despite climate change as well. So we're sort of modeling the effects of climate on energy demand. And the way that, there are obviously countries that are in a huge energy deficit right this second, but most countries would be in energy surplus, right? Although even compared to the level we modeled, the level we model is actually quite uniform across countries. It's around 15 to 20 gigajoules per person should do it if you have the right technology in place. But even if a country already has that level, they probably currently have a lot of deficit and a lot of energy poverty because of unequal distribution and because of inefficient service delivery. So both of these will have a negative impact on people's need satisfaction. So a good life for all within planetary limits may be technically possible, but we can model it. but there's certainly obstacles. So what is standing in our way? And that was one of the things we wanted to study within this project as well. So we looked at the political economy of car dependency as an example. And this is a study I recommend to you if you're interested in that sort of more qualitative aspect of our current infrastructures and technologies. So we're really looking at this interconnected physical and social provisioning system of transportation. And this was led by Giulio Mattioli at Leeds University. And he looked at these, or we as a team looked at these 5 aspects of car industry, roads and parking, so infrastructure for car use, land use for cars, neglect of public transportation, and car culture, and how the 5 really came together to create this interconnected landscape of car dependency. And it basically, when we look at all of these 5 aspects together, it really gives us a political economy anatomy of lock-in. So we were able to basically summarize some of our results in terms of the interconnections between these sectors by describing the cause and effect of these 5 different aspects on each other. And just to show you, because you can't read all this and it's worth just sort of going through the paper on its own, but just to give you an example of what this looked like, car infrastructure enables the sale of more cars, provides space to accommodate them. The status of roads goes from shared public spaces to motorized spaces, drives other modes out, and enhances the value of car ownership. Whereas in the other direction, the automotive industry plays a key role in lobbying coalitions which pressure governments to invest in public resources and co-op public space to make room for cars. So that's just one example of links, but the whole system is very interlinked. And in particular, we think that it's really essential to prioritize public transportation to get out of this. So that's just sort of a tour of some of the recent results of the Living Well Within Limits project. I'm really gone through them reasonably quickly. I'm happy to discuss them more in the Q&A session. For me, it's really important that we now go in all of our work from understanding to action. So in my view and the view of lots of other people, the urgency of the climate situation does not allow for gradual transitions either in research or reality, but really calls for radical transformation. I believe that the popular movements like the student strikes worldwide, Fridays for Future, the Sunrise Movement in the US, and Extinction Rebellion in the UK and other countries all realize this. But they might be ahead of us. So is our research supporting them? How can we contribute? How can we participate? How can we turn our resources into helping this transformation to happen? And this is something that I've been thinking about, especially since I read this wonderful article by Charlie Gardner and Claire Worldly in Nature, Ecology and Evolution, saying scientists must act on our own warnings to humanity. So the scientists who alert the world to climate and ecological crises have a moral duty to join the popular movements demanding political action. I've been part of the scientists who endorse mass civil disobedience to force action. Recently, I actually had the privilege to co-author a paper with Charlie Gardner. So I encourage you to have a look at that. We had some really concrete proposals to go from publications to public actions and to change the way universities function in facilitating advocacy and activism in the time that we're in. The other trend I think we really have to be aware of, and I'm also caught up in that because I have a court case against me, which is all, it's all very sort of Kafka or 1984 in terms of like the accusations we face and the penalties we face. But environmental protest is being criminalized around the world. And I tried to co-author and lead this letter trying to get climate and ecological scientists to raise the alarm on this trend as well. Because one of the points is that it's very clear that governments don't act on climate or the ecological crises without pressure from civil society. But at the same time, when civil society speaks up and becomes more vocal, they threaten and silence activists. So threatening and silencing activists, I think, should thus be understood to be a new form of anti-democratic refusal to act on the side. So basically governments aligning themselves with Exxon, as I showed you in the first plot, who knew very well what kind of future they were driving us into already 40 years ago. So that's sort of the time we're in, and I thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very, very much, Julia, for this thought-provoking and also very much quantitatively underpinned investigations you have made. I think many of us, including me, would need to have a bit more time to try to follow and understand all the numbers. But that's not the problem. Of course, we can look into your paper. So many thanks again. I'm sure there are lots of questions. Maybe I would just start with one question. I have many on my list, but I would just start with one question. When you showed your table of ingredients to the decent life, it was just a table. There were many. It had many dimensions, and I would wonder a bit on how you define the so to say the quantitative criteria for a decent life, which I think you must have. So one thing I guess I have understood is that I should not have an SUV, or so that this is really kind of detrimental and a bad dimension. But on the other hand, if I remember correctly, you said at one point that communication is not among the big energy consumers. So if I understood correctly, but my question would be more what am I still allowed to use and to do in terms of communication in order to obey the decent living condition? Could you give us a kind of an idea on this?
Absolutely. But so I'm just going to try to, I have a slide, but I just need to find it. So maybe we can just keep doing the discussion while I just sort of go through my presentations, because I know the slide is somewhere. I just need to locate it, and then we can discuss that. So I guess one thing I can say is that this list of sort of, it's based on energy services, not energy use. And then the question is, of course, how do you deliver those energy services? And there you have lots of technological freedom. You even have some level of social freedom as well. But we did come up with this list, and we did sort of say, okay, this is it. You have this energy service demand. Then how do you go forward with that? And I will come up with that plot in just a second, but I have not found it quite yet. So I will keep looking for it, if that's okay.
Sure. Yes.
Are there any other questions?
I think there are already 2 hands ups and 2 questions in the chat, which partly might be the same. So should I just would you allow me to start with questions already?
Yeah, please go ahead. I'll just
I'll just go according to the sequence on my screen, and this is starting with Amy.
So hi Julia, that was such a wonderful talk. I'm here at the University of Bonn, and I do the ethics of artificial intelligence. And so I'm also an Aristotelian. So I loved your conceptualization of well-being. The research that I'm getting into is the sustainability of artificial intelligence, and how do we measure that? Why are we not tracking carbon? Why is that not something that we're regulating, so that we can begin to put carbon caps on the training and tuning of AI algorithms? So I imagine in the next years to come, we will also see artificial intelligence as one of those big consumers of energy on the graphs that you showed. But something else that I wanted to ask you about, if you have any information to direct me to, or if you have any thoughts on it, autonomous vehicles are the new thing, and there's quite a few machine learning algorithms that have to be developed and constantly refined in order to have the self-driving car. So in addition to the infrastructure and all of the linkages that you pointed out and how detrimental the car industry is, I wonder if you've also looked into this idea that we are about to add another layer of complexity and environmental damage onto the car industry, which is adding artificial intelligence and all of the environmental impacts from that into this existing negative infrastructure. Are you working on that? Do you know anyone who's working on that? Do you have thoughts on that?
I have thoughts on that, which is that it's very bad. I mean, so one of the things that we're understanding, and these are results I didn't show, but the car industry is an industry that historically faced declining profit margins, and under capitalism, that's not allowed. It's do or die. And we showed in our car dependence paper some of the real barriers facing the car industry. And in Germany, this is very important, obviously, because they basically call a lot of the shots. But that one of the ways out was actually this SUV development. So this big heavy cars that they managed to market in a different way and through different financial mechanisms. So you're not buying a car anymore. You're buying a financial product. You're basically buying a form of debt. And it's all kinds of horrible and just as bad as you, maybe actually a lot worse than you might even imagine. And currently I have a collaborator who's writing up a paper on that, but it's not finished yet. And autonomous vehicles are sort of almost a next layer again. So it is environmentally detrimental. It's probably socially detrimental. But it's of a piece. It's basically, you know, it's always scrambling in this next direction. And the people who are working on this, so one of the experts who's actually currently in Germany is Julia Steinberger. So I'm just going to type his name in the chat, but I'm not sure if he's working directly on autonomous vehicles, but he knows a lot of people who are. So I would recommend contacting him at TU Dortmund because he'll know a lot more about it than I do for sure. And maybe I can go back to Jacob's point and share my screen. I found a version of the slide in French. I hope that's okay. So basically this is, I hope you can see something. So we basically pinned our colors to the mast and we said, listen, okay, this is the level of energy service where you don't feel harm. So our definition of human needs is not like comfort or luxury. It's like, if you fall below that, your chances of doing what you want to do in life, of having life projects, are harmed. So it's a negative definition. It's like a negative freedom. So we have nutrition. We have a heating surface, which is 15 meters per person. Sort of on average, it corresponds to 10 meters per person with some shared space. Now that might seem really tiny small to you. I moved from a house to a flat last year. We're not insanely far off that and we're very comfortable, but we did have to throw out a lot of stuff. Water, so 50 liters of which 20 are heated. Again, this is not, 5 showers a day, but it's enough. Communication, it's a telephone, like a smartphone per person, a laptop per household. One laptop per household might not seem like enough post-COVID, where like everybody has to have a laptop, but that was sort of what we were. It's a lot more obviously than a lot of people have currently in terms of connectivity. Mobility, it's 5,000 to 15,000 person kilometers per year, which is not nothing, but a lot of that is via public transportation. Health, we translated to hospital beds, which may or may not be the right way to do it. And everybody up to the age of 20 goes to school, just absolutely everybody. So that's sort of one way we sort of translated things. Again, I recommend looking at the work of Narasimha Rao in terms of trying to understand where this comes from and where it's going. But that's sort of where we felt that, a decent level is. And yes, there's no overconsumption in there, but maybe there's no underconsumption either. That's what we certainly wanted to ensure.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me just ask one follow-up question, and then I will stop asking questions and give the floor to others. But it's not about the numbers. So one telephone per household or per person is more on a methodological basis. So if you're talking about one telephone per person, this is probably meaning a mobile telephone. So 30 years ago, having one telephone per person would probably have been a very indecent requirement, and now it has got decent. So the world just in communication has changed a lot. So how would you take into account future developments, which are maybe good from the so to say from the energy consumption point of view? Does it mean that your table needs to be updated constantly, or do you have some more general criteria behind which always give you the right numbers without looking into what happens technologically?
Well, we obviously don't have a crystal ball. So I don't know what's going to happen in the future, if there's going to be some magic development. The rationale for one mobile phone per adult person, actually for anybody above the age of 10, was for access to education. So a lot of access to government, public and private services is now via that kind of technology. And so people would really be, so in this question of suffering harm, if you don't have one, you really suffer a disconnect from what your society can do for you. So right now, the interface to society definitely goes through a mobile phone. And that's what we cared about. So the question, that's the question for us is what that interface consists in, whether it's environmentally beneficial or not. I would say probably in Switzerland, where you used to have to go to the office for everything, you know, which takes time and transport and all kinds of things. I would say, you know, being able to download a form, fill that out and send it back without doing that is beneficial, but it's an open question. And we wanted, the other point is that we wanted to use existing technologies in our model. So we wanted to use things that were not imaginary, but actually demonstrated. But again, this is something that I would hope that other people would have other ideas. You know, I think it's a scandal that we're at the very beginning of this kind of research. We should have been doing it for a long time, but people were sort of hesitant to fund it. But hopefully maybe there's sort of a possibility space opening up. So I really welcome anybody who's interested to try to think about it and participate in it.
Thank you. Now I'll go continue to Andre Castro. Andre, you have written a chat, some lines in the chat, but maybe you want to ask your question acoustically via microphone. What do you prefer?
I can go ahead. Yeah, thanks for the presentation. It was a quite stimulating summary. So just as a quick introduction, I'm a PhD student here at the University of Bonn. So I have two questions. So the first one is about new green technologies. So most of them, they're heavily dependent on minerals like rare earth, lithium, and so many others that we majorly find in the global south. And the production and extraction of those, they have large environmental damages. And we're not only talking about carbon footprint, some of this damage is also local. Yep. So how can we square the circle? I mean, how can we move away from carbon intensive technologies without further damaging the environment? So that's the first one. And the second one is related to political economy, the role of states versus markets in achieving the need satisfactions from your line of research within planetary boundaries. So what's the role of structure of property in achieving these? I mean, the means of production, essentially. So can we do it relying in private enterprise regulation, taxation, and incentives? One example you gave is like the car industry. So even regulated markets, we might not change enough this car dependency. So
no.
What do you think?
Absolutely. So thanks a lot, Andre, for both of those questions. I think the first one, I was actually working on critical minerals and renewable technologies in the early 2010s. And we wrote a bunch of stuff and nobody really cared. And so then we stopped and moved on with our lives. But it's true that it's a huge issue and it has implications beyond emissions, like you said. And I don't at all dispute the fact that no technology is neutral in terms of these impacts. However, there has been a certain level of exaggeration of the impacts. So for instance, Michael Moore's Planet of the Humans is, a lot of that data and so on is well out of date. And the other thing is that, again, demand reduction. So if you focus on trying to get demand down, then presumably you don't have to supply as much energy around the world in order to meet that demand. So whatever the harm of these technologies on the production side, you keep them as low as you possibly can if you keep demand under control, or if you keep demand, you know, equitable and oriented towards the largest social benefit. So that's sort of my answer to that is yes, these harms exist. In some cases, they've been overstated, but they certainly do exist. And you can, I think, again, demand helps answer that question, because the idea is not to supply as much energy as we use now with those with the renewable energy technologies. The idea is to supply a lower level of demand, but that's much more beneficial for human needs. In terms of property relations, we actually looked at this, and I'll try to find a link and put it in the chat in a second. We actually looked at privatization and of public services. So privatization of electricity and public transport via buses. And so, that's just one example, but definitely ownership structure matters. And one of the things that I think is really important as a principle here is that we probably need to, this idea of profit maximization through private consumption in markets is detrimental across the board. It leads to inequality, it leads to wealth accumulation, and it leads to great environmental damage. So one of the general strategies here is to go towards what we call economic democracy, which basically means these economic activities are things that we bring in within the sphere of our community decision-making. Maybe it's municipal, bringing things back into public ownership for so that we can make sure that they serve a public purpose. And I think that our studies were reasonably conclusive, at least on the privatization of public services aspect. So the UN rapporteur on human rights, and he was UN rapporteur on human rights and inequality, I think, Phil Alston. He wrote on his report in the UK that because of our work, because of what we demonstrated, that privatizing public services that people rely upon for their daily needs is incompatible with human rights. And that's work that he's also pursued since then. He wrote a recent report that goes even further in that direction. So I think that you're exactly right, that these ownership structures matter quite a lot for a whole bunch of reasons. I'll try to find the link for that.
Next hands up is by Nicolas Brüggemann.
Yes, hello. Thanks a lot for this very informative and insightful talk. I'm leading a research group at the Research Center Jülich, and I'm a professor of terrestrial biology chemistry at the University of Bonn. My focus is on greenhouse gas emissions, carbon nitrogen cycling in natural and agricultural ecosystems, and nutrient use efficiency. I was a bit puzzled by the statement on slide 29 regarding the only negative impact of economic growth on need satisfaction. Could you go back to that slide?
Sure.
So I was a bit puzzled because I imagine that at least in developing countries, economic growth is one of the prerequisites for need satisfaction. Could you
Absolutely.
comment?
So this is the slide, but maybe I can just go back to this one, which has the equations on it. You're right, but actually what I said is economic growth beyond a moderate level.
Oh, okay.
So what we're doing here, this is the clever thing that Efim Vogel did, is he's looking not just at one factor and another factor, he's also looking at the interaction term, and the interaction term gives us the domain of validity of where this coefficient, these coefficients are significant. So we're not just looking at the results, we're looking at the result where it's really significant, and the range where economic growth is negative. So either economic growth is not relevant or it's negative, and the place where it's, so basically either it's not significant or negative. There is no case where it's positive, actually. The case where it's significant and negative is beyond moderate incomes. That's sort of that's where it picks up, basically.
And how do you define moderate?
I'd have to go back to the paper to see the exact level, but basically it's going to be that's going to come from a mapping of the different parameter space. And at some point, the coefficient becomes significant, and Efim will have written that in the paper itself. So okay. That's how we defined moderate, is because we sort of looked at it and we said, okay, from here on it's significant, and we're going to call that a moderate level because it's sort of in the middle.
Okay. Yeah.
But it's based on the quantitative analysis.
Okay. Yeah. Sure. Okay. That explains. Yeah. Thank you.
Jan Böhner is next.
Yeah, thank you. I'm working here at the University of Bonn as well on economics of sustainable land use, but I have a rather philosophical question, because I was trying to figure out which camp I'm in, and I think I'm actually schizophrenic. So I kind of sometimes feel like being more Aristotelian, but then there are also times when I look more to the other side, and I'm wondering whether it's helpful actually to think of people being either one or the other. because in a way it might be part of the driving force of what we do, that we see some progress going on. In which dimension it might be? It could be, you know, academic success. It could be income. It could be another dimension. I'm just wondering, would we perhaps come up with different options for regulating and governing our world if we accepted that we have two personalities, maybe some people more in one direction, one more in the other. The other question I have is then more methodologically, and it's linked to that. So isn't basically, if you run a country panel data set, which I think is what you did, then it always depends on when you do that in time. So you have a number of highly developed, a number of developing countries, and you have some emerging. The emergings are the ones with the highest growth, but many of them are not democratic. Isn't that also to some extent affecting your relationships, and how do you control for that and make sure that you're not measuring correlation?
The same thing. Yeah, so we thought, okay, so maybe I'll just answer the second one first, because it's a very good point. So basically, if you think of a hypothetical, and we actually did a model in the paper, so first of all, we consider these different aspects, and it's true, a lot of what you say is true, that a lot of these factors are co-correlated, but none of them were co-correlated to the extent where we could say we're only looking at one, or when we're looking at one, we're also looking at the other. There was enough diversity in there. And especially when we did the modeling, we basically did the modeling, I think, only on 3 variables. And I think it was income inequality, democratic quality, and a third one, which I forget. But basically we asked the what if question. What if all countries in the world had at median levels of these beneficial parameters, or even sort of, you know, third quartile, you know, better than average levels. And you can really see the difference. And it's true that the difference is mostly in lower income, lower development countries that tend not to have these parameters. But, and so it's true that we're looking at something that does not yet exist. You know, we're kind of looking for a unicorn. We're looking for a country that allies a lot of things that in a configuration that we don't currently see. But what's interesting is that these don't correspond, these things are not, it's a plausible parameter space. There's nothing in theory that prevents a country from having a good level of investment in public services, with a good level of democracy, with more income equality in a low income country. The things that prevent it would be things like the international trade regimen of the International Monetary Fund, with structural adjustment programs, debt relations, those kinds of things, like to do with international geopolitics and the way that the international economy is organized. But in theory, a country could, in fact, try to do that and go in that direction. And I think that that's a positive direction to think about. So we agree, and we sort of address those issues within the paper. And so it's not a perfectly satisfactory answer, but at least we tried to think about it. That's what we were indeed observing. And in terms of the choose a team, I agree that it's, you know, it's a bit what you do in academia, is you have an argument going and you keep that argument going because it's interesting and you can publish papers about it. But I think there's something a bit more than that. So I'm just going to share a slide from one of the, an image from one of the papers we co-wrote, which is on well-being and climate change mitigation. And part of the problem, so the Aristotelian view would be the third line, the lower line. The economic utility view is the top line, and sort of the happiness, sort of pure feeling, is the middle one. And the problem is that these have implications. So we basically tried to explain how these different theoretical claims in well-being research translate in terms of the link to consumption, deficiencies in consumption, the provisioning context, and what that means for climate change mitigation, for distribution and mitigation strategies. And they actually come up with different answers. Depending on the school of thought you start from, you end up with these different ways of trying to address climate change. And especially the happiness one was terrible on mitigation, because they were basically like, if people just care about happiness, they're not going to do mitigation. So the only thing you can do is prioritize adaptation, which I don't think is an acceptable strategy, honestly. We actually have to do something here if we want to avoid harm. And so from my perspective, having a needs-based perspective allows equity concerns to come to the fore, as well as sufficiency, rather than looking at just discounting, keeping with Pareto optimal distributions, which preserve inequality, and looking at cost optimal mitigation pathways, which again don't take into account human needs, what's going to be most beneficial for human well-being. So I think that I agree that at some level the different perspectives have different things to tell us, have different levels of validity and so on. But at the same time, I think it is important to recognize that these different perspectives result in different policy directions and mitigation proposals that have different implications. So I think it's just important to keep that in mind.
Any more questions? I don't see any at the moment.
There's none. I have a follow-up, if I may.
Yeah. Sure.
So I get your point that it's depending on what you assume, you come up with different implications for policy. But is then the implication of what you're saying that we can only solve this if we have a complete change in the mindset towards the needs-based approach, implying, changing the values and everything on which we are basing our decisions? Or how do you deal with the fact that there might be a substantial share of people around who are from the other camp and also will want to see that reflected in their economic structures?
This is true. I think that there's the different camp can be probably easily divided into two big categories of people. So the first thing is, like as I showed in the result on does need satisfaction lead to well-being? We actually see that it does, so that people can probably recognize that their well-being is dependent on lack of deprivation more than it is on the availability of luxury consumption. And that's something that we can demonstrate around the world and that we can see around the world. One of the most important things that people always come up, if you look at these well-being surveys, quality of life surveys, what allows people to live well, it always comes down to things like lack of uncertainty, economic security, that having a good level of things is really important, and not being insecure. So for instance, like in the US, where your healthcare can be taken away any second and so on, like that really gets in the way of people's health and mental health and so on. So I think that there is a convergence among the people who are vulnerable to not being well, who would recognize that these two perspectives actually do align, that life satisfaction and subjective well-being is in fact something that can be described as the accumulation of need satisfaction across the board. And not just, we're not just talking about subsistence and shelter, we're talking about a whole range of things, including things like economic security, healthcare, education, and so on. The second point is that the other camp also consists in the people who have the most to gain by the economic system continuing as it does, who are the people who are benefiting from wealth accumulation, right? So when we look at economic growth, for instance, economic growth, 80% of the growth accumulates to the top 1% of the population, I think, or maybe even less than that. I think that that's a result from either Oxfam or Thomas Piketty, I forget now. But the wealth accumulators will certainly want the current values where basically human aspiration is aligned with the opportunity for overconsumption or conspicuous consumption to continue. But I don't think that their interests are aligned with the vast majority of the rest of the world. And I think that that's becoming more and more visible, especially because we're also learning how they've engineered our values. So through things like advertising and so on, they've not, they're not researchers, they don't have an academic reticence to impose their values on the world, they've really done it. You know, they've really transformed the way our society is and our work and the way we think of ourselves in society, and with a very cynical purpose. And so I think that that's also something to keep in mind, is that it's not just people want to be that way out of, you know, people wake up in the morning and want to buy an SUV because it's just their personal preference. There's a huge machinery around this that has been operating for about a century at this point. If we think about, if we go back to Edward Bernays and the invention of the public relations and advertising industry, and I think that that's very important to also shine a light on, is where is our free choice? Where is what we really want and value the most in this world? And I don't think that most people would recognize it in that kind of worldview. But I might be wrong, in which case we're in trouble.
So we have arrived at 15:10 or 15:12, so I think we have to come to an end with the discussion. I think you've seen that you've given us a lot of food for thought, and yeah, there is one more, so we take one more. So Trevor.
Well, no, I was actually clapping my hand.
You're clapping. Okay.
But I guess I
Yeah.
do kind of have a question for you, and maybe this is a paper idea. So I'm American, but I moved to Brazil. I live in like a 2-bedroom apartment. My partner and I decided not to buy a car. We take public transit, and I still wonder, it's like, is that enough? You know, I mean, I can go and Google my carbon footprint, but what is like the average? What does that qualitatively look like? And maybe is there like a country that's, you said there's no country that's perfect, but is there one that's very close? And what does that look like?
So this was a result, the no country is perfect, and not even close, is from this Nature Sustainability paper in 2018. And no country satisfied all human needs and all planetary boundaries. But interestingly, there was always one country that satisfied one human need and one planetary boundary. So every pair was occupied as a space. That was one of the things that we didn't pursue further, which was sort of saying, what can we learn from the fact that this parameter space is in fact occupied, but just by a different country every time? What are they doing differently? What can we learn from them? That's something that we didn't have the resources to explore further, but I think it would be super interesting. In terms of your personal action, I think you're already doing a lot of things. There's one thing you didn't mention, which is diet, which is sort of one of the first and most important ones.
I don't eat beef.
Yeah, so it's also a question of moving towards plant-based diets is really important. Apparently everybody's moving to chicken. Chicken is not great, but other things are possible. So that's one of the things which, without spilling too many beans, beans are very important in a plant-based diet. That's going to be quite important in the next IPCC report, that basically, if you want to be able to do this diet change across the board, is very important. But the other thing in terms of personal action, there's a lot of things that are out of your control. If you're a US citizen, I mean, if you do input-output accounting, even if you don't spend any money at all, pretty much just by the fact that you're alive in the US, and that the US government and military and so on are their emissions are allocated to you as well. I think you have a huge emissions per capita before even having any money in the bank and being able to spend any of it, just by virtue of living in that society. So I think that there's also a social responsibility that is probably more or at least as equally important to activate as the sort of individual lifestyle choices. In a lot of places, people might not be able to afford certain lifestyle choices or have them as an option because they're not safe. If you're in a place where public transportation is rare or dangerous or whatever. So, so it's about advocacy, and it's about social pressure, and social pressure does work. So we come back to this question of being part of social movements and having a voice as citizens, not just as consumers. In order to enable these changes to happen, it's something that's beyond individual control in a lot of cases.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now have to come to an end. I'm quite sure that quite many people will look into quite many of your papers after this talk. Thank you very, very much again for this nice lecture. And greetings to Switzerland from my side.
Yes. Well, it's still here. Come visit by train anytime. Yeah. We would love to have you. And thanks everybody for your attention, your questions. Thank you so much.
Okay. Bye bye. Have a good day. Yeah.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.